That's okay.
Okay, we are live. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome to the Climate Fiction Book Club, where we are not reading climate fiction this month. We read climate nonfiction. We read the Red Indigenous Action to Save Our Earth. Sage and I were just saying we just finished it this morning. Will, how far did you get?
I have 25 pages left.
Okay, so you got like the gist. You got like a lot of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely gonna finish it tonight because I'm not like DNFing it anyway. I just didn't make it.
Cool. Yeah. I was expecting to be able to read it really fast, and actually it ended up taking me 3 days just because I feel like there were like so many ideas. It was so dense with ideas that I ended up reading it kind of slowly, wanting to like digest some of it first. So what did y'all think?
I think it's great. I feel like it's like definitely essential reading for anyone who cares about our survival as human beings on this planet. Yeah, that's my general thought.
There's a phrase they repeated a couple times. It's decolonization or extinction. And like, do y'all agree with that? That the only way forward is to decolonize?
Go ahead.
Essentially, yes. Like, I don't think in the near to immediate future, I think there's a way that we cannot go extinct. But if we're talking like a long period of time, then I think no. But I think there is a way for capitalism to like save itself to like a certain extent, you know? But I don't think that's sustainable or like a thing that we should consider.
Yeah, like harm reduction is possible under capitalism, but not necessarily like long-term sustainability.
And it talks about like how a lot of neoliberal like green policies are really just fixing like the symptoms but not the actual problem itself, which essentially is all rooted in colonialism. So I think I agree with it, like because just so much of the violence enacted on people and the earth itself like is extremely tied to settler colonialism.
Yeah.
So yeah, I feel like it has to go.
Yeah, I am at the point where like it's getting really frustrating for me, and I was kind of like venting this on Twitter yesterday and it kind of blew up, but it's just getting to be very frustrating for me to talk to people who don't like, who are climate people but are still just like tied to capitalism and these capitalist solutions. I got really irritated earlier today and ended up blocking this dude who just wouldn't quit and was just like, carbon taxing, we don't have to end capitalizing, just carbon taxes will fix everything. I'm like, no, dude, no way. Yeah, something that like was really depressing to me learning about was like how like eucalyptus and bamboo plantations are really ecologically destructive. Like even these like green eco-friendly industries, because they're capitalists, they're still generating, you know, as much growth as possible. They end up being exploitive in the same way like all these other cash crops are. They're extractive, right, at their root. So yeah. What were some things in the book that like really stuck out to you?
For me, like, I guess I sort of knew, but the way like the US is such like a center force in like all these problems, and how it bleeds out to the world and like how it's such a root cause to everything. And then like how extreme, like the extreme amounts where money is spent, like in the military, and like the extreme amounts, they go to protect like their capital, and like had the cruelty of like just how like in the US or like the West or has like created this like climate change problem and support the wars in the South, and then the cruelty of like denying then the immigrants or like people stay. It's like they've created the problem and then yeah, deny them like any right. Like it's just like it's so cruel to me, and I don't understand like how people in power can feel okay about running like this sort of system.
Oh. And hey, Philip just said hi. Hi, Philip. And everyone who's watching, if y'all want to jump in with your comments, things you took away from the book, we'll put it on the screen below. Yeah, the idea of like the US in particular, like all, wealthy nations, the US in particular, owing this carbon debt to the rest of the world. And like we need to, and like the idea of reparations, bigger than just like the reparations the US owes to Black Americans, but like the reparations the US owes to the entire global South, like everywhere we've colonized, everywhere we've touched, everywhere we've set up a military base, and everywhere that's been affected by the climate change that we're like the #1 drivers of. Like, yeah, reparations.
Mm-hmm.
It's like 4 trillion. Like I'm just
Billy Gould said centering caretaking economically stuck out to me. I loved that too, as like a teacher, a former teacher, and like a parent, who's mostly just a stay-at-home parent. Like, yes, the idea of like truly valuing and centering our economy on caretaking labor was like so powerful and beautiful to me. Thank you for bringing that up. And like, caretaking your environment, like I feel like our generation are so hungry. Like I know so many people who would love to get a job like restoring a prairie, or like or like healing the earth, or like doing something that improves our local ecosystem. Everyone I know would want to sign up for a job like that. There's so much labor to be done in restoring the earth, and there's just no mechanisms under capitalism to value that work.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's like demonized, and people who are fighting for the earth are getting like murdered.
Yeah. That kind of leads into like something that stuck out to me big time was like the concept of food scarcity and like seeds specifically, and how like the seeds that have been in indigenous cultures and practices for so long been just like displaced, destroyed, like criminalized even. And I really liked the comparison, and just like the long kind of extended metaphor, but also the intense reality of like the seed being related to the womb, and how when like your environment is poisoned and you're drinking contaminated water, living in breathing contaminated air, and that's affecting your body as you're pregnant, and that's affecting your fetuses, like eggs, if they have eggs, or their like whatever their reproductive thing is, and how like it's just this continuous cycle of like the genocide that continues. They reference what's her name, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, I think is her name, who wrote the indigenous people's history in the United States, but she also wrote or co-wrote All the Indians Died Off and Other Myths About Native Americans, I think is what it's called. And like in that, like that was a really good precursor for me to this book, just in like understanding the reality of like the human society's like largest genocide that is ongoing of indigenous people. I think that's something that is just like definitely stuck out to me in the book that I can't stop thinking about.
Yeah, definitely like how much suicide there is, and how like that is rooted in like the caretaking isn't prioritized, and that saving people is never really like the main thing they care about. because it's not affecting like people with money as much. So like, for example, because COVID affects everyone, all of a sudden people care about saving lives. But because like it's like Indigenous people who die a lot from suicides and stuff, then all of a sudden it's not prioritized.
And we saw that this week, like there's so much attention on this white woman who's gone missing and been murdered, and that's a tragedy, this Gabby Petito. But there's these just so many hundreds of Indigenous women who've gone, and women in Two-Spirit and gender nonconforming people who've gone missing, and there's just absolutely no media attention because those lives aren't valued by the media, by white supremacist society. Absolutely. Yeah. Man. Yeah. The part about suicide was really scary as well. I want to bring back up this comment. I haven't finished it, but there can be no rich people without poor people. The rich depend on the poor, but the poor don't need the rich. We only need each other. And that's true on an individual level. And also, right, this book really shows how that's true on the level of nations and like Indigenous peoples. And this is what's making me so frustrated about like a bunch of like really popular white climate people online. And one of them yesterday, this guy, Peter Kalmus, he's like a climate scientist. He's like really popular. And he was saying yesterday, like, the left is so divisive. There's no broad class conscious movement, against climate change because we're so worried about identity politics. And it's like white people I don't know. I feel like he's just like ignoring the fact that the global South collectively, Indigenous peoples have been organizing in conjunction for decades, like Palestinians and Native Americans, like the Palestinian delegation to the UN were the first people to bring in Native Americans to the UN General Assembly. Like they were the first people to recognize the sovereignty of Indigenous people. So like Indigenous sovereignty worldwide is this strong coalition, which white climate activists want to reduce to identity politics because they see how all these things are interconnected that they were talking about in this book, and how it's not just like, you can't just fight for one little incremental climate policy divested of like all these connections that were being made in this book, if that makes sense. And Philip says, yes, it is so terrible that the 2,100 billionaires in the world own as much as 4.6 billion people. I mean, it's just a total absurdity. And here's a question that I have for you is like, reading this book, I don't know, I find it very energizing, but people have a real hard time imagining the end of capitalism. And like, to me, this is the way forward and everything they're saying makes sense. But then it's also, I despair a little bit because the thought of it happening seems so far-fetched. And like, I don't know, what do y'all think about that, about the sheer idealism of imagining and calling for like full Indigenous sovereignty, full land back, full stop to capitalism?
For me, I think it's like a mind consciousness thing. Like in the beginning of the book, I believe they talked about how it's so easy for us, like as like today, to imagine a dystopian world because those are the stories that have been told over and over. And there hasn't been left room for like the utopian reality of what the world can be. And so I feel like we've never been taught to like imagine that way of living. But once we start talking and imagining what the world can be and make it like normal to like lust for a thing that can happen and a reality that like we can create, I think, yeah, it's possible.
I agree. And like the part where they just like very blatantly said like capitalism is going to collapse. Like it just does not, it's not a long-term like healthy infrastructure, like it in some way or another. And we've seen it like start to crumble in so many ways and all of these little fixes like, again, like fixing the symptoms and not like the actual problem of capitalism. And so I like the idea of like, yeah, I mean, definitely like the mindset thing, but also just like working toward this idea, even if it does seem like far-fetched, or, but honestly, like it's so much more graspable and possible than like colonizing another planet, you know, like this is very much a possibility and also like something that is going to happen. So if we can start, you know, developing these practices, or like giving land back and returning, like, or listening to indigenous people, and yeah, like all of these treaties and everything, if we can just go in that direction knowing that it's inevitably going to happen, I feel like that's easier than like something like, oh well, we have to fight this within capitalism because capitalism is always going to be there. But this actually like provides a lot more space for creative thinking and creative problem solving when it comes to the climate crisis in general. Yeah,
That makes me think of something else, like that you say, like also the book, like you said now, with how capitalism like will collapse at some point. Do you feel like it would come to a point where like they would seek out like indigenous people to like aid, like they like I don't want to say like wave the white flag, but essentially say like we need you?
Who's they?
Like
half
like
of
the
us?
people who want to earn money and like who have money when they can no longer like.
So maybe this is sort of what you're talking about, but the plastics corporations used a Native American guy who I believe was in actually like a Latino guy in red face in the 70s for their anti-littering campaign, because trash was just piling up everywhere because of plastics. And so they had this like Native American in like buckskin looking out at like, you know, a meadow covered in like garbage, or maybe he was on a beach or something, and then like a single tear rolled down his face. And so it was like using an indigenous representation to like create this anti-littering campaign, which actually that was funded by the plastics industry because that was an example of them putting the blame for pollution on the consumer rather than accepting it themselves at a time where like resistance was rising to plastics. Like, hey, should we be using single-use plastics and everything? Like, this is creating a lot of garbage. And then to deal with that from a PR standpoint, they did it to the consumer with the anti-littering campaign. And they used Native Americans as like the imagery of Native Americans as like a figurehead for that campaign. Is that sort of what you're talking about?
No, I meant more like if there will come a point where like the systems in place will like actively look for indigenous power and wisdom.
Well, I mean, and this year in the US, that for the first time, what is it, Department of Interior, which oversees like Native American affairs, is run by a Native American woman, Deb Holland. I think that's how you say her name. But they're still doing pipelines and shit. Like, it hasn't fixed everything. I thought a really powerful line that I really liked was where they were like, we don't want a seat at your table. We want you to get your table off our lands. And that was big to me for understanding that. Yeah. And I feel like a lot of white people are like scared of this idea of land back, like full land back, because they're like, well, but I live here and I've lived here my whole life. And like, what does that mean for me? But for me, like, we don't own the land. Like, I'm lucky as a millennial to be able to like, we own our house, but we don't really, the bank owns it. And we own this massive debt to a bank, you know? The vast majority of the US is owned by like banks and then like mega corporations. I would much rather all this land be owned by Native American people than by banks and Monsanto and Purdue and these like big ag corporations and real estate companies. Someone was saying Zillow is buying up like a shitload of houses too.
Scary.
Yeah.
Really understand. Oh, sorry. Go, Sage.
Oh, no, I was just going to kind of go off of what you were saying earlier too. I do think that like a lot of, I don't know, maybe not like corporations, but like public services are starting to implement more Indigenous practices, but with kind of without like recognizing what they're doing, like, or really like honoring that they are using those practices. Like an example of that is in Oregon this year, they did a bunch of like controlled burns and specifically like dug trenches and just did a lot of like wildfire prevention work that is like very much rooted in Indigenous practices. It was really helpful in a lot of ways. Like a lot of the fires from in the Mount Hood area like didn't come over this way when they could have. And so like that in itself, like there are like, yeah, I guess this like knowledge is an inevitable thing, but also like the knowledge is there. And I think I don't think that it will necessarily be like a white flag kind of thing, like, okay, you lead the way because like Indigenous people know what they're doing. But I think it'll almost be more like commodifying Indigenous practices and like exploiting that before, like if we don't like set the policies and like take the action to make sure that it's actually Indigenous people who are the leaders in that.
That's why I think one of the really helpful things in this book was making sure that your activism is grounded in like principles of decolonization and anti-capitalism. Because there are a zillion causes and groups and things you can do, right, to be an activist. And like, we all have very limited time. And so something I really wrestle with is like, just what is the best use of my efforts? There's like so many causes and stuff that I want to support. Even if I'm just saying hyper local, there's like a lot going on. And a lot of it feels futile. A lot of it feels like, is this more important than that? Like, you know, how do you decide where to put your time? And I think this book gave a lot of like really good kind of grounding principles. Like look for things that are being led by Indigenous people or like Black and brown people organizing against racism, rather than going to the white-led nonprofits that are, you know, that have all this money and are flush with cash and have this like website and everything, because they're not really resisting capitalism. They're just sort of working towards these incremental reforms. So I don't know, some of those guiding principles were like helpful to me.
And I think also like with the understanding that like all areas of activism are equally important and needed, because like the book also talks about how everything is connected. So like not everyone is equally passionate about every single thing. But when everyone does what they're really passionate about, like that goal will eventually lead to like the same result and the like equal justice for everyone, I think.
Yeah. Shay with the hobbies said it would be an amazing thing. And I think this was a comment from a little while back about like getting rid of capitalism, you know, this sort of big dream that's laid out in this book. But so many people still cling to that American dream that fuels capitalism. The fact that only 18% of Americans make 150K, but people still argue 100K isn't a lot. Yeah, you have to sell people on a very different kind of dream, right? And as a writer, that is why I'm like so excited about solar punk right now, is just, I want there to be a lot of fiction and stories set in these worlds that don't seem realistic at all right now, but where like people live in community. Like people can't even imagine what it would be like to live in community, to live in the kind of caretaking economy talked about in this book. So at very least as a fiction writer, I feel like, okay, I really want to start writing worlds like this and writing stories that shows like a little bit like how might we get from where we are to this place where that's just not capitalist. Just, you know, as creatives, that's something we can do to show that vision.
Yeah, I feel like that's been kind of my ongoing frustration with the climate fiction we've been reading too, is like it is all so rooted in like a dystopian future based on capitalism continuing the way it is going. Yeah, I'm excited to read your work, Sim.
Yeah, well, most of what I was writing like the last few years was dystopian. But I'm just really shifting gears towards more solar punk stuff. And I actually, I can't announce it yet, but I'm going to be having another book.
Nice.
I can't really say more about that, but it's more going to be like one of those stories about like moving from dystopia towards utopia. So I know for our next pick, I absolutely want to pick like a solar punk something more optimistic.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The next one's gonna be really depressing, but hopefully more rooted in like reality than dystopian.
Cool. The fact that we are paying to live is ludicrous. Like, we do not have to. That is the wonderful freeing message of this book. It's like there are ways of living where we just take care of each other.
I love the part where it was just like, okay, close your eyes. Imagine a future where everyone has a home.
Yeah.
This is wholesome and I love
Allow yourself to do it.
Yeah, seriously. It is hot. Like, capitalism has really ingrained this like inner critique of every single thing we do. And I think like it applies to like our sense of creativity, like literally our need to commodify everything that like commodify our hobbies or whatever. But it's like we have this inner critique that's just like, that's not realistic. Sorry. That's not what you see in media. That's not what's going to make you money. Like, it's just, you have to like be instantly combating this like really loud inner voice that's created by capitalism and the rhetoric that we experience literally everywhere. So
I experienced that very directly kind of recently. My book was actually at acquisitions with one publisher, and the editor really loved it and wanted to buy it. And the sales team said that they did not think they could sell young adult books with climate themes. That was the whole reason that they passed on my book, was that they would not sell, they wouldn't buy YA with climate themes. So yeah, like what we're allowed to imagine, what we're allowing children to imagine.
Yeah.
Controlled.
Seriously.
Yeah.
I just got the children's book, We Are the Water Protectors. I'm so excited.
Oh, I love that one. It's good. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'm like going to potentially be submitting to Pitch Wars, and
awesome.
I also have a YA novel that with climate themes, so now I'm scared. But hopefully it'll speak to someone.
Hey, but you know, I ended up signing, and the thing is, you may end up having to sign with kind of a smaller press rather than like the really big publishing houses, but like there are, you know, more outlets that are open to these things, especially the more indie presses and stuff.
Yeah.
I
think that's much more my jam anyway, especially when we are thinking about how we create things under capitalism.
Yeah, the story about what's going on in Bolivia, man, and with like Evo Morales, I remember all that playing out, and I wasn't like super tapped into it, but that was really that was just a few years ago. We funded a coup. Sometimes we talk about, like, I think that there are some liberals who are aware that the US was funding a lot of like anti-socialist, you know, coups and assassinations in like the 1970s. And they don't realize, like, and we did it like 2 years ago, I think it was in 2019, right? Or 2018. Very, like, we are definitely still just like fighting socialism anywhere people are trying to like unite, empower, to resist climate change, extractive capitalism. The United States military is there with like the full force of violence.
Yeah.
And it really will take a global people-powered solidarity movement to oppose that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how like this is something that is so, I don't know, prevalent literally everywhere on the globe. Like, I don't know, everyone's just so impacted. Even there was a part where they were talking, I think it was again about like the food scarcity and like salmon is like a really big food source for a lot of coastal indigenous communities, and they're like, we don't, it like it's not just for us, like the bears also need the salmon, and like the bears also need the berries, and like just this like huge idea that we're so like humans are the only ones like living the struggle is like we've literally just annihilated so much of the population of other species so quickly, like within the last 70 years. And it's yeah, I don't know, like I feel like a part of this shifting to thinking about like the actual end of capitalism also means like thinking about other like parts of the ecosystem and parts of the world that we've just been so conditioned to like not see as valuable, or
and
to
like
only food. Sorry, go ahead.
No, like also just to add to what you said, like also how natives like see us humans as so young, and that there's so much wisdom to be found like in older species.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have very low wisdom because we're destroying our home and all the processes that we need and rely on, and we poisoned all the water and all the air, and it's not smart, or not wise, rather.
Yeah.
Kind of like on to what Shay with the
you
said.
You want me to put this comment, this one?
Yeah. I think this book, like, for me, maybe opened up, like, how much, like, the U.S. practices, like, imperialism still. Like, just, like, to what degree, you know? Which I thought this, like, book illustrated really well and how it affects everything.
And just this week, we just found $1 billion. Like Congress can't do anything to help our people. Congress can't do anything to help our environment, but they just found $1 billion to give to Israel for the Iron Dome, for guns, for missiles for another country. And that's another, indigenous struggle there. I mean, the Palestinian people are indigenous to the region. Israel is this white settler colonialist state. I'm saying fully as a Jew, by the way. And they've just weaponized like accusations of anti-Semitism to just make it so that, I don't know, in some ways I see like Israel as like, maybe it's because I'm Jewish, but like, and I'm an anti-Zionist Jew, but I see Israel as like the crux of imperialism and climate and everything. Like it's just the flashpoint for the whole world.
And it's something that we can like really see and quantify right now. Like it's one thing. I mean, it's one impactful thing to read about the billions of people who have been murdered under the genocide of settler colonialism in the past, but to realize like this is currently happening and we can see it like literally on Instagram.
The bombs falling. Yeah.
But yeah, the idea of like we have the resources. They're just all being put into military and imperialism.
Mm-hmm. I love this idea as well that treaties should include non-human parties. I don't know if are you referencing Nick Estes has a book called Our History is the Future. And if anybody liked this book and want sort of a deeper dive into some of the history that was mentioned really briefly, this is the history of the tradition of indigenous resistance among like the Lakota and Dakota and Nakota tribes from starting with like Wounded Knee and then going all the way through to Standing Rock. And he actually starts the book with like this myth that was mentioned really briefly in the story about like this treaty that was made between white buffalo women, and like the first treaty was between buffalo and people, and like, we are not going to kill so many of you that you can't continue, and we can like live together and benefit each other. And that I don't know, this is just like a really powerful idea that we don't have in our culture at all. And I love this idea of like restoring like positive non-human relations. It's also something that was in braiding sweetgrass, which I know all of us were like really impacted by. Just that idea of restoring positive relations with the natural world.
Mm-hmm. And how like we also can have a positive relation to the natural world. Like we're not inherently toxic to the planet. We've just made it to be that way. But we can actually contribute to the planet.
That's why I hate the word Anthropocene, which was also mentioned in here. And that was something that got heated on the Discord, our Discord server one time. People arguing over using the word Anthropocene or saying stuff like humans are a parasite, humans are to blame or whatever. Because this really is not, capitalism is not practiced by everybody. Extractive, resources were not practiced by everybody. There's millions and millions of indigenous people who manage to live in harmony with the earth. So like describing it as a humanity problem, like all humans are to blame, is really not it. Mm-hmm. So
that makes me think too of like the narrative of like overpopulation being a problem within climate change, and just like the idea that there are many people in this world living in a way that there are like those graphs, that's like, if everyone in the world lived like an American, we would need like 7 worlds to fulfill that or whatever. And then there are like people who are just like growing their own food, or maybe like, doing like not
positively contributing.
Yeah.
By like the Stop Line 3 protesters, right? They're in positive relation with the earth, right? They're all these indigenous people protecting the forest and stuff.
Yeah, like instead of like how many earths would we need to like suck dry to sustain our life, it's like how many like earths can we be in relationship with and like feed opposed to like take from.
Yeah,
it's definitely like this constant flip of our thinking. Sorry, Will, I cut you off.
No, I cut you off. But I just like the same thing. I think like this book did that well. Like I think a lot of times people will say, like, for example, like defund the police, and that would be like a slogan. But like it's very powerful to say like, what will we fund?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just the rhetoric of the word reform.
Yeah, also a great word.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like this idea of like planting trees, what can you do to be in positive relation with the earth? So I like inspired by this book. I got back to also a cold front. So it's not like horribly hot outside. So I got back to work digging up my front yard, because longtime listeners may remember I'm digging up my front yard and planting native prairie. But it's like very like just like with a little hand trowel, like scraping up all the sod. It's a lot of work, but it's going to be a pretty big patch there. I planted a bunch more prairie seeds. And what's cool is I was planting now seeds that I saved from last spring's flowers. So over the summer when all the spring flowers died, I saved their seeds, and I was like replanting those today, because this is the time to plant for spring in Houston. So
whoa.
Yeah,
timeline in Oregon. Yeah, I'm actually moving today.
Whoa.
And we're moving like right next door to like 10-acre property with like a little house. It's very adorable. And truly a dream. But also like I've been thinking constantly about like how can I like go like live this cottagecore life, but in a way that's like not harmful, you know? So yeah, I'm excited. Actually, when we went to go like look at it, we knew like the lady who lived there. It's a very like close connection kind of thing. But when we went to go look at it, there was okay, I like saw this deer, but I don't know if it was just like my mind playing tricks on me or if it was real, but like it's like lip was kind of like torn off so I could like see its jaw. It was very scary. And so I've been reflecting on like what that meant. And the lady who lived there would just like treat the whole property with pesticides, like just go into town spraying pesticides to keep the weeds away. Well, and also by weeds, just like the native things there. There are definitely like invasive things, but they're super easy to pull if you just like take time to do it. So I do feel like I need to just like take time to literally just like heal that land itself because it's so, you know, just it's just been like ruined by chemicals.
That's cool. You know,
metaphor.
And it seems like these are like small things, but that's what I was thinking too. I was like, it's all this labor to make this little tiny patch of prairie beside the road or whatever. But as soon as I started doing it, a whole bunch of bugs move in, you know? And like I see all these bumblebees and stuff, and just all these bees and bugs just appear out of nowhere. And it's like at least it makes a difference to those bugs, you know?
Totally. Yeah.
Like, yeah, I mean, I think that's great. And then, you know, do what you can. I see it almost as like it's for my heart and soul, you know, like gardening, it like restores. And they recommend gardening as one of in the last chapter where they're kind of going over like the big picture recommendations of what to do, you know? The gardening is a really powerful way of like building community and food sovereignty and resiliency. But then also like get with the anti-capitalists in your area. Like
totally.
Do that. So
something I really liked about the book, there's this one quote where say scientists are denied funding for projects that are not considered profitable or that directly disrupts the flow of capital to the already wealthy, and how like indigenous wisdom is like not like scientists are not like scientists and technologies are not like opposed to indigenous beliefs, you know. How was I going to connect that to what you guys said?
I don't know, but it's a good point.
But like how I guess like the technology, because I read this book, The Soil Will Save Us, which basically talks about like how we can we still have time to like save the soil and the health of the soil with like, I love that book. I would recommend it. It's a great book because it also builds a lot on like the things from breeding sweetgrass, but more from like a technological standpoint, but with a lot of those beliefs and how like that can be used with like an indigenous perspective, and like we can use science with the earth, because that book also says that the only reason why there's like an overflow of bugs is because the soil is not healthy, and so it like the balance isn't there. But if the balance between like the soil and like the plants and the air was intact, then the bugs wouldn't be a problem. But because there is an imbalance, it is a problem for the food growth, and that's why we use pesticides to like treat the problem rather than like relearn
that's totally evil. Yeah, that makes me think of what the book was talking about in like some African countries where there's like a bunch of bug swarms. What was it? I can't remember anymore. But or was it like locusts or something?
Yeah.
There's just like, there was a swarm of them bigger than New York City.
Yeah, that happened right before the pandemic, so I feel like people forget. It got kind of overshadowed. It was while the wildfires were burning in Australia too. There was a lot, and then the pandemic was happening, and there was a lot going on. January, that was like January 2020, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do like how they mention like literally like we are facing this climate crisis because there is an unbalance, and like to start thinking about, I think like you can think about how to create that own balance in your own life by like doing the activism rooted in Indigenous work and supporting that and showing up for that, and also like caring for the land that you're living on. Also,
okay, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, speaking of land back, I'm very excited about this, but the Grand Ron tribe here in Oregon just reclaimed this like giant mill that's in Oregon City, which is like pretty close to where I live. And it's a mill like on a big waterfall. And they've been polluting the Willamette River for so long. Like it's such a horrible thing. And it's just been sitting like dilapidated for years now since it got closed down. And the tribe just bought it back. And
that's awesome.
So they like had this huge ceremony where they like knocked a wall down, and yeah, I'm very excited.
That's great.
It's so possible, you know. Land back is not like a not realistic thing.
So I want to bring up one thing that was like probably the hardest pill to swallow in here for me as like a hiker and a lover of nature, which was that land back sometimes means like you don't get to enjoy that land anymore. Sorry, nature people. And I've just been thinking a lot in general, just kind of like raising my awareness of how like all tourism is, or like very much most tourism is exploitive and anti-Indigenous, and essentially a big problem with air travel being like, like the jet fuels. So, it like your entire year of carbon emissions is like one plane flight. So that's like a really hard thing. That's the hardest thing in here for me to sit with. But then I posit it against like, we drive, to like, there's like very few state parks and national parks around here that are like remotely pretty because Houston is so ugly. But I like go there to like feed my soul so I can go be in nature for a little bit. And like, I would so much rather just where I live be beautiful, and be restored. And it's like, I would trade it. I would trade travel and tourism, and getting to see all these beautiful remote places all around the world for a community that I live in where I feel like I can be in touch with nature, like right when I go outside, like every day. I would trade it.
I've been thinking about that a lot.
One thing, I only have 5%, and I think my mom brought her charger back to my charger back to Sweden by accident.
Oh no!
If I log off, maybe I can do it on my phone and get back to you. But
okay,
what was I say?
Okay.
I was gonna say, I've been thinking a lot about that too, and I've talked about before, like in the context of rock climbing, like thinking about just like what that actually like. Just the idea that so many people have that like they are entitled to going and like bolting rock and like claiming it as like they like discovered it. Like it's just colonialism at its finest, like in a sport. Like it's so icky to me now that I can see it back. And also I've been reading this book called Native Daughter, and I think like the subtitle is Colonialism and Sovereignty for Indigenous Hawaiian people. And that has also just like my mind has been blown at that book because it's like tourism to Hawaii and like all of the Pacific Islands and like really like tourism in itself, like in all contexts, is so harmful. And like what is tourism if not just like a little taste of like settler colonialism, you know?
Yeah, like feeling entitled to like spaces.
Yeah, tourists are, or at least like white tourists who like travel to, yeah, like big places like Hawaii, and like the Maldives is like a big one right now too, that's facing a lot of tourism and like climate issues as well. They're just like so much entitlement.
Well, and the
And
pandemic is making it also just more obvious than ever. Like
yeah,
guns, germs, and steel, like bringing the germs. And like so many Native Hawaiians have been on Twitter, like begging people not to go to Hawaii. Their hospitals are full. Like every restaurant is full. Every highway is clogged. Like, and there's just no limit to it. Like they have no right to, under the legal system, to be like, sorry, the island's full. Actually, sorry that the rest of the world isn't letting you travel there because we're a giant plague ship. You know,
yeah, and even like the laws that are like supposed to prevent the spread of COVID in Hawaii are targeted at like people who live there, but like specifically indigenous people there, and it doesn't put like any of the responsibility on tourism whatsoever. They're like, oh, like you need to stop traveling to Vegas and coming back if you live here. It's like there are thousands of people coming to Hawaii each day that have inevitably been to like worse places than Vegas. So yeah. Also, Vegas as itself is another place to think about, like,
oh yeah,
the effects of tourism.
All of our big desert cities, honestly, are a problem.
And I think also like there wouldn't be a need to go on like vacation unless people felt like overworked because of capitalism. Like if people like felt at peace at home and like didn't feel like they needed a break from life, then maybe they wouldn't feel the need to like need to get away.
Yeah, if they weren't surrounded by concrete, if they didn't have to drive to get everywhere, if their air and water around them wasn't like sick and polluted. Yeah. I like, yeah. I think I'm going to be traveling a lot less. And like, I grew up in Chicago and I have a lot of friends back in Chicago. And there is a train to Chicago. It takes like all day. It's like a sleeper train. The US has really bad train infrastructure. Will, I don't know if you know.
I've been told.
But I think like the next time I go to visit my friends in Chicago, I'm going to take the train because it's the right thing to do. I don't know. But then I have to take a whole day on the train. It makes it more of a thing. It's like I can't do this every year anymore. It's going to have to be something where I like really save up for it and like set the time aside to travel somewhere.
I also just think about like the I mean, like travel itself is obviously very like class, like rooted in classism, and like I grew up poor, and like none of my, or one of my siblings, but the majority of my family like hasn't ever set foot on a plane. And I have like a lot of, like friends and like now like in-law family members who like are on a plane like multiple times a year, and it's just such a huge contrast that like very much is just like, again, rooted in capitalism. I don't know. I just need to reflect on that for a second.
Yeah. And I wish almost like it was so normalized too when we were kids, like that you could live really far and there was no even discussion. I mean, I never thought about the consequences of plane flights until a few years ago. And so like making the decision to come to Houston after I graduated college was such a big, I never imagined I would live here forever. I always thought I was just going to be here for a year or two and then go home and live in Chicago. It was like, I'm so far from my family and my roots and everything. And that's just been really normalized. Like people are just they move really far away, just thinking that they can just like hop on a plane and go home. And like, that's going to be a very hard pill to swallow too. Of like, we can't keep doing that. Like, it's not sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think too, like, thinking about, I don't know, like our impact, but also still like keeping room for the reality of like, you know, the oil industry. And I don't know, like it's important to like make the efforts that you can to obviously like minimize your own impact, but also like it needs to end, you know? Like the oil industry needs to be abolished 100% if we want to survive. So I don't know. It's like this. It's a balance in thought.
But I think like for that to happen, like what this book also touches on is like the power of the people when we all like fight for the same goal. And there's a part where they talk about like because of all the mental health issues the majority has because of the systems of oppression, it's hard to like organize because everyone's struggling so much like with their personal stuff. So I think also like creating a space in your life and the people around you for like for community, for love, and like practice like that for yourself and others so that can spread and people can feel like it's easier to rise against those systems.
Yeah. And like Sage, I think it was saying neoliberal capitalism will never end the fossil fuel industry. Like they're not going to do it. They're not capable. There's no mechanism for shutting down things that make a lot of money.
Yeah,
So,
and benefit the people in neoliberal politics.
Yeah. So people power, these mass people movements, and the ones that have been really successful at stopping the fossil fuel companies have been indigenous movements. You know, indigenous-led movements are saving the planet. Like,
yeah.
So I just think we got to throw whatever we can behind them. So also I put in the links to this video. I want to be sure to mention there's some links to the Stop Line 3, which is a major pipeline protest that's been going on now. It's been going on for years, but there's some like really simple actions that you can take if you've been watching this video. There's some emails that you can send with a form they've got there, and you can donate to them, and you can make calls for them, and you can show up for them if you're someone who could just like drop everything and go camp out. Like, that's super awesome. And man, if I didn't have kids. So yeah. Check that out, please. Also, I put a link to the Red Nation, who wrote this book. It's a collective of like radical indigenous folks. I think Nick Estes is one of them who wrote this book I mentioned. And they have a podcast, the Red Nation podcast, where we can keep learning about this stuff. And who's doing next month's pick? Who is it? It's Will, right? So what's the book?
How Beautiful We Were by Imbu. Okay. Ibe Imbu? Maybe? I think a place takes in, by Imbulu Mbwe. Maybe you say it like that. I think it takes place in Nigeria, and it's about oil. Yeah.
We'll learn a lot.
But I think it takes place in like nowadays stuff, which I guess we haven't like read so much about. So hopefully that will be interesting.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, contemporary climate stuff is really very into that. Cool. How Beautiful We Were. We will get it. We will try to meet on the last weekend of October. Is that right? All right, cool. I have not picked my next pick yet, but it will probably be, since I'm so pissed off about having been rejected for YA Clifi, it's going to be a YA book. We're going to try another YA book because we only did War Girls, and then it ended up not even really being climate fiction. So I'm going to try one that's for real.
I think my next pick is YA as well.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe if it's not different enough, I'll do something else. But,
okay.
Yeah. What's yours, Sage?
It is. Oh, God, let me find it. Okay, it's called Fox Hunt by Rem Wigmore. And it is queer fantasy. So maybe it's not YA. But I think it's
it looks very cool though. I love the cover.
Me too.
Okay. It's not YA. Okay, cool. So we can do a YA after.
Nice. The cover is a little YA, but it's not YA.
Yeah. All right, neat. I think we lost Will. I think Will's battery died. Or wait, no, wait, there's Will. Will. Oh, well. We're just saying goodbye. I don't know why it's not coming up. I think this is Will on their phone now. Oh, well. Thank you, everybody, for watching and commenting. And it was a really good discussion this time. And I liked this little nonfiction pick once in a while thing.
I do too.
Yeah. Next time there's a nonfiction book that's like, we really need to read this one, we'll do it. Thanks for the great discussion. Thank you, Philip, for all your comments, and Shay, and Biblioghoul, and PA Storytime. It was great. And we'll see you next time.